Okay, well, let's get going. Welcome, everyone. I'm David Myers, the Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Alliance, a leading alliance of conservation finance practitioners and experts all around the world, working to use the tools of conservation finance to achieve our conservation outcomes. And we're very excited today to have a special webinar here that'll be focusing on debt conversions, also known as debt for nature swaps. And as many of you know, these have been around for quite some time, and were the source of many conservation trust funds' initial endowments. And there's been a bit of a revival with them, and now with the sort of Build Back Better post-COVID economic strategies, there's an increasing interest in them. And so we're fortunate enough to have two colleagues from the International Institute for Environment and Development, Paul Steele and Sejal Patel. They're both economists. Paul is the chief economist for IIED and working on some really interesting things. They've just released a paper called Tackling the Triple Crisis, Using Debt Swaps to Address Debt, Climate, and Nature Loss post-COVID-19. And they're going to share with us some insights from that paper. We also have Kevin Bender from the Nature Conservancy. Kevin's TNC's acting deputy managing director for NatureVest, and he is leading the TNC's initiative for conservation, to finance conservation through these debt conversions. And so we're going to have short presentations, about 10 to 15 minutes each, from each of these two groups, give some background information, and we'll have roughly around 25 minutes for Q&A. I'll start off with a couple questions, but we're going to be very interested to hear what your questions are. As we usually do, everyone's keeping their mics shut off for now. When we see you've asked a question that we'd like to pose to the panelists, then we will ask you to unmute yourself at that time and go ahead and ask the question, and that's how we can get some really good participation from everyone. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Paul and Sejal, who will give us a presentation on their recent work. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, David. I'm going to share my screen now to bring up our presentation. And Sejal's going to kick off by presenting first.
Sure, thanks, Paul. Thanks, David. And hi, everyone. Thanks for having us here. It's really great to be exploring and learning from the conservation NGOs in this space and on this issue. So as David was mentioning, Paul and I just released this paper, Tackling the Triple Crisis, Using Debt Swaps to Address Debt, Climate, and Nature loss post-COVID-19. And I'll just start off by running through some of the key background points, and then Paul will take over. So in this presentation, we're looking to set the context and to get into a discussion of how large-scale swaps can be tangibly operationalized. So we'll start with some background on the triple crisis, which is driving the need for the effective responses and for fit-for-purpose tools, one of which could be debt swaps. Then we'll briefly lay out some of what climate and nature debt swaps are, and then talk about some of the aspects. So the intended economic benefits, the resurgence of swaps for green economy, green recovery, post-COVID, the need to build on past experiences, which point to the need for scaling up swaps by taking a program approach, performance-based payment examples and performance-based commitments, and the incentives of climate and nature program swaps for different actors. So touch points to tap into to get widespread engagement. And finally, we'll look at what role conservation NGOs can play in supporting this agenda, and whether we'll see an of sorts international initiative for highly indebted countries' climate and nature program swaps. So a new kind of HICCNS that aims at long-term debt sustainability. So then just going into that background a little, and I'm sure everyone on the call will be quite familiar with the triple crisis, but there's been rising levels of debt across developing countries and rising debt distress in the wake of COVID, which if it's not addressed can lead to widespread debt crisis. So the graph shows that debt stocks in developing countries have been rising for some time. And it shows a slowdown during the 90s where the HICCNS and the Midri initiatives came in. But since the financial crisis in 2008, debt's been rising sharply again. And the majority of that debt has been private debt, which is shown by the blue area in the graph. And at the same time, we're also facing global climate crisis and nature crisis. So the IPCC have warned that unless we transform our systems to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, and they give a timeline of action to reach such a pathway within the next 10 years now, we'll face unprecedented changes in natural systems, so going beyond any of our prior experience. And at the same time, we're causing an unprecedented destruction of nature, which is having an equally dangerous impact and quite severe forecasts for our future. And while there's a lot of attempts at the moment at global coordination on these issues, the policies, commitments, and resource mobilization endeavors are not yet sufficient. So debt for climate and nature program swaps can present one mechanism that helps to address these three global crises with some coherence. Debt for climate and nature program swaps are where a creditor agrees for the debt to be reduced, either by conversion of the debt to local currency, lowering the interest rate, and some portion of debt write-off. Then the money saved from this restructuring can then be used to invest in poverty reduction and growth enhancing activities. So those relating to building climate resilience, supporting mitigation activities, and supporting biodiversity protection. And in the past, NGOs have played a role in bringing in additional financing through grants, mostly for these transactions, and really taking that opportunity of this restructuring to attract further funding for climate and nature activities. And there are a number of ways in which debt for climate and nature swaps can provide benefits. A swap can increase fiscal space in the debtor country's government budget, which is particularly important at the moment as many government budgets will be stretched with increases in health and social safety spending. Swaps can also be a mechanism for helping increase and earmark investments for nature and climate activities. They can also support growth through sustainable investments. They can reduce the debt stock sufficiently enough to improve long-term debt sustainability, and they can help reduce poverty through pro-poor investments. And so looking at the history of swaps, swaps began around 1984, but tailed off as a mechanism since the 2000s. And there have been sporadic cases, but not anything with a lot of momentum. And in the green recovery post-COVID context, we're now seeing a resurgence of swaps as a potentially fit for purpose way of coherently dealing with the triple crisis. And so there's evidence of widespread interest. So for example, Biden's climate plan, which has recently become very relevant, mentions green debt relief for developing countries that make climate commitments. The IMF are showing interest. Kristalina Georgieva has mentioned swaps in some of her speeches, and the IMF are having internal discussions. The World Bank are also showing interest. They're setting up a technical working group to explore some of the technical aspects. There's been interest from a number of IMF EDs, including the German, Dutch, and UK EDs. There is the UN financing for development option for swaps. Many debtor countries are also showing strong interest, including Cabo Verde, Uganda, Jamaica, Pakistan, Costa Rica, Namibia, and Ecuador, and there are ongoing discussions in China. So I'll hand it over to Paul now to talk about this in some more detail.
Thanks, Sejal. So the next challenge and where we focus on in our paper is how to get large-scale debt for climate and nature swaps. So far, as many of you will know, and as David alluded to this, the previous debt swaps that took place in the 1980s and 2000s focused on smaller projects with the money managed in trust funds by international NGOs. And I'm sure Kevin will talk about some of the work that TNC has been doing in this respect. For example, in Latin America in the 1980s, and then in Seychelles in 2018 with the Climate for Nature swap. But the challenge with these is they've typically had relatively high transaction costs. So the costs of administering and negotiating and setting them up has been quite high relative to the amount of debt actually swapped. So we propose that these swaps shift from fragmented projects to a more systematic program through the use of budget support, where the funds are paid directly into a debtor government's own budget. And this, we argue, has three main benefits. First of all, budget support allows for larger amounts of funds to be swapped and therefore lowers transaction costs. Secondly, budget support increases debtor government ownership. And thirdly, budget support shifts accountability to national citizens and away from external NGOs. And the swap as budget support will be managed as performance-based payments based on agreed policy commitments, of which I'll explain more just now. Large-scale debt for climate and nature swaps as performance-based payments have many similar examples which we want to just explain. The IMF balance of payments and macroeconomic support, which many least developed countries and developing countries receive, is paid in installments linked to policy actions with periodic reviews by IMF staff. Similarly, the World Bank has something called the Development Policy-Based Lending Tool, where again, payments are made and against policy commitments. Thirdly, the European Union provides budget support to many developing countries and makes that payment conditional on certain criteria. In the environmental sphere, we have the example of Norway's payments for reduced emissions for deforestation and forest degradation, or REDD+, where payments are made on the basis that countries such as Indonesia agree to certain criteria for improved forestry management. And then coming to debt swaps, small island developing states, or SIDS, and least developing countries, or LDCs, are proposing similar approaches of using government systems. For example, the Caribbean SIDS climate and nature swap proposal uses this approach, and similarly, the LDC Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience, or LIFE-AR, also suggests using a government financial system for payments. So what would be the performance-based commitments for large-scale swaps? And this is, I think, where conservation NGOs can come in and provide support. So it's less on actually managing the funds through the trust fund and more on the commitments, which would be linked to nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, from the climate point of view, or national biodiversity strategies and action plans, or NBSAPs, for the biodiversity point of view, with technical assistance from conservation NGOs. And here are some examples for such commitments. First of all, the dollars worth of spending on climate adaptation or the social protection for climate disasters. Secondly, the thousands of households made climate resilient. Thirdly, the tons of climate emissions mitigated linked to energy access. Fourthly, the hectares of watersheds are forested with employment by the poor. Fifthly, hectares of land restored with employment by the poor. And finally, and this is an example which is taken up by the Seychelles in their climate swap, the square kilometers of marine protected areas set up for fish breeding and ecotourism. Then in our paper, we set up the priority countries for climate and nature program swaps by ranking countries according to their debt distress, their climate vulnerability, their biodiversity richness, and their credit worthiness. And we come up with a first priority of Cape Verde and Vietnam, Second priority, Honduras, Kenya, Nicaragua, Papua New Guinea. And third priority, you can see a list of countries there. But basically, the list of priority countries spans both least developed countries and middle-income countries, spans Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and also spans small island developing states and much larger countries. So what are some of the incentives for restructuring using climate and nature program debt swaps? What would the different stakeholders get out of it? First of all, ministries of finance and central banks in debtor countries would get hopefully economic growth generated from their investments in climate and nature. This would improve debt sustainability and also through use of budget support, increase the ownership of debt swaps. Conservation NGOs would get access to climate finance that dwarfs the Green Climate Fund and also new biodiversity finance. China, as host of the UN Biodiversity Convention next year, would get finance for biodiversity, and private creditors, who, as Sejal demonstrated, are now so important, would get increased debt sustainability, so they would have reduced haircuts on their debt. They would also have alignment with sustainable investment commitments, and then for some of them, possible existing emission credits could be generated. And finally, the Paris Club of Creditors would get finance for climate and also reduce post-HICCNS lack of debt sustainability by generating growth through the investments in climate and nature. And this is our final slide. What is the role of conservation NGOs? Hopefully many of you are on this call and we can discuss this going forward. How can we collectively work together on an international initiative on highly indebted countries' climate and nature program swaps? So we have four main recommendations. We call on the international community and conservation NGOs to work with debtor countries on an international highly indebted countries' climate and nature swap initiative, to join a technical working group which, as Sejal mentioned, is already being set up under guidance of the World Bank with IMF support. Discuss and pilot this approach with interested debtor countries, for example, the small island developing states. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, provide technical support, especially on the climate and nature policy commitments for the performance-based payments under the scheme. And fourthly, to work with the G20 under the Italian presidency, develop a memorandum of understanding and a clause of compatibility of treatment, as has been done for the other debt suspension initiatives of the G20. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Sejal and Paul, thank you very much for that comprehensive presentation. Really interesting, interesting material, interesting questions, and interesting proposal to go forward. Very much happy to pass it over to Kevin Bender right now from the Nature Conservancy. And as you all mostly know, TNC has been quite active in this space recently, and Kevin will tell us about it. So Kevin, over to you.
Okay, thank you, David. So following on Paul and Sejal's presentation and report, which I think is a very timely report and hits a lot of things that are, I'm glad we're having this conversation now. I'm going to focus on the one tool that we have in this universe of opportunity, and be very specific, and then I'm happy to take questions in the panel discussion and the Q&A. But we're really just doing one thing that kind of fits with that, and there's a whole world of things to do that could be similar or different. But let me share my screen and just walk through some of the slides. Hold on one second. Can you see this?
Yes, it's working.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, so we have a standard deck. I think I recognize a lot of names on the attendees. So a lot of people have seen many of these slides before, or at least this structure. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but basically what we're doing is we're building off of the Seychelles transaction that we did a few years back, and we've made some key changes to our approach. And one of those key changes is that we've moved from the bilateral world into the commercial debt world. So as you saw on the slide before, that Seychelles was walking us through, that the commercial debt has become rather large, and that depending on what level of development the country is, could be a very large and very burdensome debt load for the economy. So it's something that many countries are more interested in addressing than the bilateral, although it has its own complications. So along the lines of the global work, actually I'm not going to spend too much on this, the climate conditionality that the world is looking at now with the DSSI and the G20 and the IMF restructurings. We've been doing this for marine conservation exclusively. So I'm not going to go over the Seychelles model. I'm just going to show you what we've moved into. But basically, our approach is to go to countries that have a debt burden, a commercial debt burden, and offer them a plan that has three components to it. One is the debt conversion, where we buy the existing debt and restructure it in a beneficial way, and we'll get into what those benefits are. But we also set up a conservation trust fund and need commitment by the government to set up a conservation trust fund to disperse these cash flows that we create, and to commit to doing a marine spatial plan. And then a marine spatial plan is not necessarily a conservation plan, but there should be conservation in it. So we control the conservation. We advise and work with the country on doing the plan, and include and ensure that conservation is included in that plan. So those are the three pillars that we have in this one product. What we're talking about here today is the debt conversion, but it's very similar along the lines of conditionality. And then when we do the debt conversion, we restructure a loan, replacing the existing credit, whether it's a bond or a bank loan, or in case of Seychelles, a bilateral loan. And then there are these commitments in the loan agreement that they must commit to doing the marine spatial plan. They must commit to setting up the trust fund. The trust fund, unlike what we've talked about earlier in the earlier presentation, is technically not on budget. It's off budget. We set up a trust fund where the government is involved in this trust fund, but they have a minority seat. So it's not, the corporate governance structure is not government budget, but the structure could work the same with being on budget. And then we have steps where we ask the country to commit to placing 30% of their marine area under marine protected areas, and usually half of that is in no-take high protection zones. So then in the loan agreement, we have those commitments spelled out. At a certain date, they will have X% under protection, 10%, 20%, 30%. So it is a good model for what we're looking on the climate. Quickly, this is the structure. If you start at number one, we've set up a subsidiary that an SPV that borrows the money in the capital markets. I'll go through the structure in a second, and then that structure buys the existing debt and creates the loan, helps the government retire it, and then creates the new loan to the government. So we fund that structure through several SPVs, but it issues bonds into the capital markets. And the reason we're issuing bonds into the capital markets is because we have on our loan heavy political risk insurance structures that give us a very high rating. So as opposed to and this is important to know, that as opposed to going to impact investors who may be interested in higher risk products and want to finance this, we're putting a lot of insurance from bilateral insurers as well as commercial insurers and reinsurers to get the structure right, so we can come out to the market and issue in the category of a single A plus, double A minus. So that is a very, very large universe of investors that we want to tap into, as opposed to the smaller, much smaller impact investor universe. And these bonds, we can use within that large universe of investors. We can really negotiate the price down and try to get as much as we can. So that's key to the structure, as we are approaching a very large investor base the world over. So then we use that money that we raise in the market to buy the debt at a discount. And the math gets a little tricky in here, but you can think of it as the discounted amount that we buy, if a bond's trading at 70 cents on the dollar or something, we use that discount to create another note of the same size, and that note pays for the conservation. Those trust funds go into the conservation. I'll give you another slide on this, so it'll be a little bit easier to look at. And then we issue two notes, one for conservation, which is the size of the discount often, and then one that goes for to pay back our bondholders. We call that the impact note. Before we do all this, we negotiate with the government as to what the benefits would be for the Ministry of Finance side and what the cash flows would be for conservation. And we also negotiate the conservation commitments. And like I said, those conservation commitments of 30% under protection by 10% by this date, 20%, and then up to 30% by another date, for example, that all goes into the loan agreement. So they are bound by a legal document to getting these things. So very much like a World Bank type loan, and many other loans. We do have the ability to extend those, that's on us because our SPV is signing that loan. So if a country doesn't hit the 10% by the considered date, we can extend that time. There's an automatic grace period, and then it's at our discretion to extend it. So it's not super punitive, and we can work with them if they're making progress, but there's something beyond their control, like a natural disaster event or something like that, we can extend that. But it does go into the legal document. And if they do not meet that, we take away the benefit that we've given them, right? So they have to retroactively pay the higher rate of interest that they would have paid if we had never come in. And that money goes into an escrow account. And if they do rectify it, then the money comes back, and any money that's built up from that doesn't go to TNC, it just goes to the endowment that we build to it. It all goes into conservation at the end of the day. But the penalty is they lose the savings. And that savings could be a result from a forgiveness of principal. For instance, we could take the outstanding debt down 10% or something. If it's trading at 70, we could take 10% of what we buy and get rid of it. Or we lower the interest rate, so we could go from an 8% interest rate to a 6% interest rate. And then the other option that we have is we could extend the tenor. If they've got something that's coming due now and they want to push it back, we could take a 2025 and turn it into a 2030 maturity or something along those lines. The impact notes are usually in the neighborhood of 10%, 10-year tenor, but the conservation notes, which are much smaller and fund the conservation, go out 20 years. And then if you look at this kind of dotted box here, what we do is we set up cash flows for conservation on a semi-annual basis. So every time there's a payment, money goes into the Conservation Trust Fund, and the Conservation Trust Fund funds the projects on the ground. And then we put part of that money from the conservation note also to capitalize an endowment that grows. And that endowment is just a typical endowment. It's only designed that with our estimates of return on investment over the life and after, that we can replicate similar cash flows after the life of the loan. So it all just doesn't disappear at the end of the day. So that's the general structure. And this is the financial structure. So if you look at this dotted line up here, this is the original debt. We have this existing debt in the market, and a commercial bank or the bond market has it with the government, and then we replace that debt. And that could be in full or in part. If it's a smaller country, if we're doing a deal of $500 million, that sounds like a lot, but for debt of countries, that's not really, for a larger country like South Africa or Mexico, that's not a large amount of percentage of their debt. For a smaller SIDS or something like that, it could be all of their debt. So we can do it in part or in full. So we set up this SPV, the Blue Investment Company, and that investment company issues the bonds to the bond market. The bond market finances this entity, which goes to the government and buys back the current debt in the market. So as we then become the creditor to the country for that amount, it's the loan between this SPV and the government that we have the political risk insurance on. And then that insurance gets, through other financial structuring, gets passed back, the lower risk gets passed back to the bondholders. And like I said, we're pretty comfortable that we will be issuing somewhere in the single A plus, double A minus range. And the governments that we're looking at are mostly single B, double B, probably double B minus. So that's the market side. And on the other side of the bottom side is the conservation. So this is the impact note that we get from the government to pay back the bondholders. And then there's another note that just goes through, and that's the conservation note. And that either pays directly on a semi-annual basis to the conservation trust fund for the projects and finances the endowment to go forward. So the conservation trust fund works in the sense that we don't know what the projects will be. We put in, guidelines as to what they're available to invest in, but anybody can go to the conservation trust fund and finance projects that meet our criteria on marine conservation. So it could be mangrove reforesting, it could be, seagrass planting, it could be anything. It could be, it could be an entrepreneur coming in to reforest mangroves and needs a grant to get it done. It could be a water utility that doesn't want to, wants to stop just dumping raw sewage into the ocean and needs money to leverage a bond so they can pay for that. We could grant money for that. It could be the government, if the government needs ships and boats and staff to police marine parks. Anybody can go to this entity and apply. We don't have preset projects that they could that this will fund. And like I said, this is just a slide on the governance of the trust fund, that the government is involved on the board, but not it's not majority controlled. So that's the highlight of the structure. I think a lot of people, like I said, a lot of people have seen this, but it's different. The main difference from those who know the Seychelles model very well is that we are fully focusing on the commercial debt, buying commercial debt instead of bilateral debt, and financing ourselves in the capital markets. So I'll stop there.
Great, Kevin, thank you so much. Wow, we have really kind of two different approaches, or as Kevin was saying, sort of they're focused on this, using the commercial markets here, and what Paul and Sejal are talking about is sort of how do you engage a government at larger scales, and the multilateral development banks, and obviously there's opportunity for all approaches here. And I think one of the interesting pieces, which is relatively new to me, is trying to tie performance-based payments to it. And my first question is I'm familiar more with the TNC approach and conservation trust funds, and that and maintaining the flexibility that Kevin was talking about, I think is really essential, especially as we're heading into somewhat uncharted territory. But how would you how do you come up, this is for Paul and Sejal, how do you come up with the right incentives and indicators, and to assure that the money is being spent to achieve the outcomes that you're looking for?
Thanks, David. Maybe I can kick off and Sejal can add. I notice it's similar to one of the questions in the chat about corruption. How do you make sure that the government is spending the money correctly? I've got a whole host of responses to that, because it's something as you may have picked up, that we feel quite strongly about. The first point to make is that a lot of donor money has been going into public financial management in many of these countries. And I think generally this has been paying off, and public financial management and quality of public expenditure has been improving. The second point is if the IMF and the World Bank and the EU, as I demonstrated in my presentation, is willing to make these performance-based loans and macroeconomic support for budgets as a whole, why is the conservation community being different? We don't see education or health trust funds. So again, why do we have to have conservation trust funds? Frankly, it seems to me another example of the conservation community trying to do things differently. and it creates the danger, which again is something I feel strongly about, that conservation is again presented as a foreign-funded external priority, which is not core to the domestic political priorities of the country in question. So I think if we do discover there's a country where we want to do conservation and some of the public financial management is weak, we should invest in those public financial management systems rather than setting up some parallel structure to get around that. But I'll stop there and see if Sergio wants to add.
Well, I'm going to jump in here before we go further down that path. Obviously, you missed the launch last week of our 10-year review of conservation trust funds. You know, I highly recommend having a look at that. It is, you know, conservation trust funds, first off, are they're national institutions. They may have been started with support from the international NGO community, but the design and the whole purpose of that is to, you know, involve government and to become a conduit for facilitating finance for conservation. And you know, they haven't been perfect, but the track record actually is looking quite good. And you know, there's parallels with like water funds as well, which are also been proven quite successful. There's quite a number of them and quite great opportunity all over the world. So I'm not saying there's an if or one or the other kind of thing. I think that there's clearly place for all of it. So the question is, you know, given that there already is IMF, World Bank, and other support for governments for these kind of things, why do you feel that putting a performance, pay for performance type approach in this will achieve the outcomes that we are desiring clearly, given that, you know, the history of some of the challenges of having you know, work, and absolutely working governments they fund 60% of conservation from their national budgets. These are, you know, governments are essential partners in us achieving this, but, you know, maybe again, you know, large amounts of money. How do you, you know, is it additional leverage? You know, what's the approach?
Well, apologies for missing. We did try, in fact, in preparation for this seminar, to track down your recent report, but unfortunately we couldn't find it. So apologies for missing that. But we'll definitely look at that. But maybe I could hand over to Sejal if you want to respond on the performance-based aspect.
Sure. So, and maybe also going back to the point on how do you figure out the right indicators and why have this kind of system. Part of that is that identifying the right indicators is a process in itself. I don't think that's the starting point. I think for a lot of countries, they need to undertake processes still to understand, and these need to be whole of society processes where they're engaging local people, local actors, as well as national actors to understand what the needs are and where priorities need to go, and therefore what activities should be funded going forward. And NDCs and national plans are a good starting point for that, but often they're not as adequate as needed for something of this scale to have that pipeline ready for investment. So I think a whole part of it is kind of identifying the right measures and then basing something like a performance-based measure on those measures. And then you have something that's fit for purpose, it's relevant for the local communities, it's relevant at the national level, and it's something that will hold up long term. And you see a number of countries that are actually taking these processes at the moment. So we are working quite a lot with the LDC group. And you see within the LDCs, they are taking the leadership in this sense of they've undertaken a group vision, and now they are taking national processes where they're trying to create national platforms which have representatives across society to be able to undertake whole of society processes in their planning and linking up with global financial mechanisms, and to be able to channel the money where they need to strengthen their national systems and where they need to invest in climate and nature. So I think that comes back to the broader point of just sort of supporting countries with local and national ownership, which is really at the heart of it.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, the national biodiversity strategy and action plans that all the countries are, required to produce for CBD almost entirely, most countries are do not come budgeted and do not come financed. And so this, maybe that is a mechanism, but there needs to be perhaps improvement in the NBSAP process to come up with really tangible budgeted plans. But this could be a push in that direction. Kevin, over to you. Just real quickly, because I want to open up to questions from the audience. The commercial side of this, I mean, there's a huge demand for green bonds. Of course, the growth has been astronomical. Will your commercial offerings qualify for certified green bonds under maybe climate bond initiative or something like that? Or you've thought about it? Is this going to add to the value of it?
Sure. Okay, if I could just address one thing first before getting to that on what you were just talking about. On the budget side, what we're doing is, as we structure these, we create two sources of benefit, right, on the cash flow side. One goes directly to the conservation finance, which goes to the trust fund and is not controlled by the budget, but is involved with the government, like I said. So we want to make sure that that does not reduce the budget, right? We don't want to give the government, say, here's your environmental budget, and they'll say, oh, great, now we've got $2 million, $3 million a year coming in. Let's just cut our budget by 2 or 3 million, and we haven't produced anything. So we have to make sure it's additional and not, just wiping out one and there's no gain there. And then on the other part of the savings, which we always ensure is less than the savings for the cash flows for conservation, is the benefit for the Ministry of Finance, right? So that could just be a flat out wiping away of $25 million of debt that they didn't have to pay, or that could be a savings of $7 million a year or something along those lines that they have money for. We do not put conditionality on that, but that could be done, right? So that just goes right back to the budget, and that just goes to the big budget, and that's savings from the Ministry of Finance. A structure could easily say, that has to go to COVID relief or, job creation or education or whatever you want to put it in. You could put those, we don't do that, but that could easily, in a debt conversion transaction, could say this has to go to those. So those are the two things I wanted to say on budget, off budget. On the commercial side, we're looking at that to see if that would be of benefit. I'm not, we definitely have a high overlap of green, of climate and green bonds. I'm not sure if we would qualify for a green bond. We're also in the process of exploring whether it would qualify for a blue bond, because it's not quite, the methodology for blue bonds is nowhere near what it is for green bonds, but I don't think there's any way this could not be a blue bond who qualify for that. So we will be looking into that, and that's just part of our strategy to make sure we get the lowest price we can in the market. Any type of certification or even just addressing the right investors in that larger universe, we would pursue all that stuff just to get our spread down in the market.
Great. Well, I'm going to go to a couple of questions coming in here. I think maybe you've already responded to Eric Swanson's question. Jim Tolosano, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, I'll jump in, David.
Hey.
How are you?
Okay.
I guess I'm just curious. I mean, this is all very exciting to hear, and exciting to hear this topic being revitalized so much. But how do you engage both the creditor and the country when we're talking about debt scales that are so enormous, and when historically we look at these debt swaps, and the actual amount of the debt that's resolved is kind of negligible overall, and with the high transaction costs, how do we bring everybody to the table to get them, excited to do this again?
Is this for me? Or?
I'm not sure who I'm directing that to. Anyone who wants to take that on.
And I could start and give a stab at it. You're right. There are countries that we would be a drop in the bucket. Ministries of finance. There's an added headline benefit to this for countries that want to do conservation. So it's not just a solely financial transaction. So countries may, countries that this works much better with smaller economies that do need the financing to do their conservation, like their heart's in the right place, they want to do it, but they need conservation funding to get it done, and they've got a high debt burden. For them, it's an easy conversation. But you're right, when you want to get to quite often the larger economies that have the larger coastlines as well, like Mexico, Argentina, South Africa, it's not enough to move the Minister of Finance to say this is a great idea, right? It has to be more of a conservation and finance, and it's a conservation play with financial savings. It's not a financial savings that has a conservation thing in these larger ones. In the smaller, it can easily be the Ministry of Finance wants to push this because it's large enough. And in some cases, we could even restructure all of the external debt. A lot of countries have gone through consolidation into putting all their external debt into a bond, and now they're suffering with that bond. So we could restructure that whole bond in some cases, which makes it very attractive. But on the larger side, it has to be a conservation story.
Great. Well, I'm going to jump around a little bit here because I'd love to give the talking stick to Melissa Moy, who's been involved with debt swaps for many years. I believe the first time I ever heard the concept was from Melissa's mouth. So, Melissa, I don't know, you had a couple thoughts and maybe a question?
Hi. Anyway, it's great to see some new ideas in this area. I have to say, within WWF, we have been batting around ideas around addressing this issue from a larger, more multilateral approach. So the sort of programmatic approach to me is very interesting, but I would agree with most of the people, or not most, but a few of the people on the call who've said the budget support idea is one that really needs to be thought through. If you look at Mozambique, that's a country that had one of the largest multilateral debt relief funds back in the day, and they now are one of the countries that is most indebted. And so you have a situation where you're rewarding the bad performers. And honestly, one of the reasons why they have such problems around debt, as Jim would have said, is the corruption, or Eric Swanson as well, the corruption issue. And I think to characterize conservation trust funds as being owned by NGOs really misses the point. I think David was trying to pick up on that, but if you look at the literature and you talk to, for example, Samuel Sangweza, who's on this call, they will tell you that these funds are very much owned by the countries where they are operating. And in fact, one of the hallmarks of them is that they're able to get money to the local level in a way that governments, in fact, sometimes can't. And so I think that I really recommend that you and I'm talking to Paul and Sejal, take a close look at how conservation trust funds operate, because they're not perceived in many of the countries where they operate as being somehow, or dependent on NGOs. I think that your model reminds me the most of perhaps the way the French government addressed debt conversion through their debt development contract approach, the C2D, where what they did was basically to say that with their HICCNS debt relief, they allocated that debt relief to 3 different sectors: education, health, and environment, and then left it to working with the government for whatever debtor country it was. They negotiated a package of debt relief in each of those sectors through several rounds of debt relief. And this was in the context of the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. The thing about it was that that initiative required a heavy level of negotiation. And in some cases, the money did go into sort of government budget supported projects, but in others, it went actually towards conservation through, for example, the Madagascar Fund or Biofund in Mozambique. And so it was kind of a combination of approaches. But I would argue, and this is probably my biggest reaction to your proposal, that to have it go in the form of budget support would mean that the likelihood of it hitting the field would be much less. And also on the performance-based part of it, look at the performance of the Amazon Fund and compare that to the project finance for performance ARPA fund, and you tell me which one worked. So I'll leave on that note. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. Great to have some historical perspective. I don't know if anyone wants to respond, or if you're happy for me to move on to another question.
It's great to get some other responses.
Yeah, and I could say a couple of words there, and just thanking Melissa for the comments. And no, I agree, where it's working, that's great. And our point isn't that it doesn't work in trust funds. Our point is we're approaching it from that perspective where it's also trying to build those long-term capabilities and capacities in countries, not precluding what's already there or what other systems are working. But it's to kind of support both the process of funding climate and nature, but also funding and building capacities in country, whether that's through national or local systems, because those delivery channels are what's going to be important for long-term longevity of climate and nature actions. And if you look at the LDC initiative that I was talking about, they've made a commitment for channeling 70% of any financing to the local level. So it's not that the financing will necessarily get stuck at the national level if it's going through national systems. I think it's also about the priorities that are put upon within the national and local systems. But I think the biggest priority, I guess, coming back to one of the earlier points, is that we need more funding. It needs to be a large-scale approach. It needs to tackle all of the debt in the country through a sort of comprehensive process and bring all creditors to the table. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. Yeah, no, this is a great opportunity. It's really great we're having this discussion because the scale is substantial, and how do we address it in the best way? I just want to give. I want to try to get to at least two more questions and comments. And I'm going to again jump around. Jean-Paul Adam, who was involved in the Seychelles debt swap, is on. And Jean-Paul, if you would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the floor. Though I think Paul and Sejal are tired of seeing me recently. But Kevin, we had a great experience in Seychelles for the debt swap, and I think there's a lot of value in terms of the approach that was taken, even though the amount of debt was small. And I think some of the benefits of doing it through a trust fund, as have been mentioned, are that there's a high level of transparency, you touch the local populations, there are a lot of advantages. But I think one of the big issues which Paul has pointed out, and Paul and Sejal, is that the debt swaps are treated as exceptional. They are something which is done in an ad hoc manner and once in a while, and that leads to the high transactional costs. And I think if we can move to a scenario where they are, because they are just another form of debt restructuring which actually benefits the country. And I think you need a menu of options. And I think that the option, for example, of going to a trust fund is going to be very useful and perhaps even essential in some contexts. But I think particularly when we need to upscale and look at the value, I think the wider context of COVID-19 responses, I think budget support has to be looked at. And also in the context of the IMF and the World Bank do have mechanisms to monitor this in certain countries. So, I think it's something that if it's something which is adopted, it can become very useful. The key question I have for Kevin is around how do we make sure that we get commercial debtors to be interested in the debt swap? So in the Seychelles experience, it was Paris Club creditors that came to the table, essentially on the basis of they saw the long-term value. It became a mark of prestige to be involved in this debt swap. But commercial creditors might just look and say, well, I've got a high-performing, I've got a high interest rate on this existing bond. Why should I swap it now and lose future earnings? Unless, of course, that debt is already distressed. But then the argument will be, well, there are other mechanisms that might be more advantageous rather than going for a debt for conservation or debt for climate swap. So I just wanted to have your thoughts on how we bring the commercial debtors to the table. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a good question. And it's a totally different conversation that we're having, that you have with a commercial financing than you would with bilateral, because some bilaterals don't want to give up their exposure and their lending because they lose the relationship with the country. So there's good and bad on both sides. If we look at the two sources of commercial financing, one is very easy and one is more negotiation, but there's benefit to both. One is, if you're looking at the bond markets, those debts are priced with a discount, some of them with a discount, some of them with a premium, but the ones that have the discount, it's priced every day, right? Maybe not every day, but quite often. So we know that Angola is trading at 80 cents on the dollar, right? So we could go out and buy bonds. If we can make it work, we can go back to the Ministry of Finance and say, here's today's price. We feel we could pull money out of the debt out of the market of these 3 bonds or something, and we can bring you $500 million worth of a restructuring right now, and just buy that and do it. The cost of the transaction, a lot of those costs are our costs because we're creating the structure and the SPVs and the like, and we have donors who are financing my teams and our SPV and our legal work, and then we also pay for the transaction costs out of the transaction itself, right? So it doesn't go back to the Ministry of Finance with a bill. So if it's a large enough discount, it works pretty easily, not easily, but it works well mathematically pretty easily. If you have quite often, countries don't go to the capital markets, they go to banks if they're in a hurry, right? Because they're faster, but the banks put on much more conditionality. It's a faster deal, but it's a more cumbersome deal and also a more burdensome deal. In which case, if you're going to a bank in a hurry, quite often you're paying a higher interest rate, right? The banks know that. They know you're not going to the bond market for a reason, so they charge. So often the debt that they want to restructure is with banks. If it's a country where there's a bank, where they have bank loans and they have bond loans, we can go back to Citibank, Standard Chartered, HSBC, or whoever and say, look, the bonds are trading at 70. Are you interested in getting rid of your debt at 70? We can do that. And that's a decision for the bank to make. The banks also get press out of this. If they're selling at a discount, they can use this as part of their, environmental benefit, headline benefit. Talking to them, there's some other issues with banks and the rating agencies, but there's not that issue in the debt. But in the bonds. But it's not that hard of a conversation to sit down with banks. Sometimes the banks are just like, no, we want to play this game. Some banks are saying, look, we gave a 10-year loan. We didn't expect them to make it this far, but we've made our money back and are happy to get rid of it at a discount. That's their decision. That decision is a longer negotiation than just going to the debt markets and saying, we're tendering at this. Anybody want to sell, we'll buy it at this amount. So there's reasons for that banks will negotiate with us and work with us. And the nice thing about a bank is you're usually talking to one person who just goes to their credit committee or their asset liability committee, and they get a decision and they move, and it can be done. You know who you're talking to, and you know whether it's going to work. So it's doable. It's a conversation that's worth having, particularly in this era, right? Because of the economic slowdown and the countries that are getting hit by the COVID economic slowdown, and several months ago, they were getting simultaneously hit by an economic collapse and a collapse in oil prices. So oil exporters really got hammered. And in that case, Citibank might say, you know what, this might be a good time to cut our losses, be thankful for what we got. Because if they get into a default situation, it's a long, drawn out process where they probably will not get the money back that they think they're going to get back. And they know that. So it's a conversation we can have and do have with banks.
Kevin, thank you so much. I feel like we need at least a half an hour to cover all these topics in any right level, but unfortunately we're coming to the end of our hour here, and I'm sure people do have to go. I just want to say, Valerie Leidekirk, very sorry I didn't get to your question, but I just want to take a moment to thank the panelists for great presentations and really excellent insight. And I think that this is a huge topic of extreme importance, and I'm so glad we were able to discuss it. If you want to keep the conversation going, maybe answer some of the questions on the chat. The CFA does have a LinkedIn page, and there's a possibility to join, like I don't know what it's called, a sort of discussion group or something like that. And we'll move some of these questions there. And come join that LinkedIn page. It's relatively new for us, so it's not very active, but but it's growing. And again, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks Bryce Bray for helping set this up, and Kumar for organizing behind the scenes. And look forward to keeping the conversation going. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.